Well, coming to you from the Toby Family Auditorium at the Commonwealth Club, it's Week to Week, the political roundtable for Monday, May 21st, 2018. Welcome, everyone, to our program in which we will spend an entire hour not talking about the royal wedding. You're welcome. Okay, just
Maybe
for
a couple
you,
minutes.
just for you, I'll note that comedian John Oliver watched the bishop's moving sermon. Did you see this? He was talking about the transformative power of love, and Oliver quipped that the bishop was talking to the wrong crowd because the British royal family are some of the most repressed people in the world. He said, talking to the Queen about love is like talking to her about the transformative power of a Taco Bell $5 meal, unquote. So that's it. You survived our one royal wedding moment for the evening. I'm John Zipper, your host for Week to Week and the Commonwealth Club's Vice President of Media and Editorial. On today's program, we're going to discuss the war on Mueller, the Farm Bill, some state election news, the latest from the president's world, of course, some political responses to rising racism and anti-Semitism, and more. And of course, we'll end the evening with our live news quiz. I always mention that the Commonwealth Club has people from all across the political spectrum. They're all welcome here. So any opinions you hear expressed here are here, obviously, I keep saying that. Any opinions you hear expressed tonight are those solely of the speakers and not of the Commonwealth Club. Now let's meet our panelists for today. I'll start at the far end with Carson Bruno, Assistant Dean for Admissions and Program Relations at Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy. He's also a former Hoover Institute Research Fellow. You can find him on Twitter at CarsonJF.Bruno. So welcome back, Carson.
Hi.
Now, joining us for the first time, we're pleased to welcome Sarah Pompey. She has more than a decade of experience at the top levels of American politics and corporate America, including working with the Meg Whitman campaign and for Congressman Kevin McCarthy. She's launched her own public affairs consulting firm, Pompey 8, which, by the way, is spelled VIII, because if you have a name like Pompey, you use Roman numerals.
Of course.
She's on Twitter at Sarah Pompey, so welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
And next to me is Dan Schnurr, professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications and at the UC Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies. He's on Twitter at Dan Schnurr, so welcome back, Dan. I think you all know the way we do it here. There are question cards spread throughout the room. If you have a question, write it down. Someone will pick it up and deliver it to me, and I will try to ask as many as I can during our conversation this hour. Now, I wanted to start with the single most scintillating topic anyone can think of, and that is the Farm Bill. But I want to kind of get into, perhaps, does this show kind of the shifting power balance in Congress, or at least within the Republicans. So last week, House Speaker Paul Ryan could not get a farm bill through his caucus after party conservatives rejected the bill and the moderates were revolting over immigration. Let me start with Dan. Is Ryan unable to govern effectively now that he's effectively a lame duck as a speaker?
Well, to be fair to Ryan, when it comes to an issue like immigration, he was not able to lead the caucus before he was a lame duck.
Okay.
And that is not a criticism of Ryan as much as it is simply a reflection of the tremendous and growing split within the Republican Party on a critically important issue. And on one hand, Ryan has a group of those who now call themselves moderates within the Republican Party agitating very heavily for a vote on behalf of a path to legalization, if not citizenship for dreamers. And on the other hand, a group of very fervent conservatives in the Freedom Caucus who want only the most stringent of immigration reform. Up until now, he knows he's not been able to get 218 votes for either. He's about to have his hand forced, and it doesn't appear that there's a good outcome for him either way.
Sarah, what do you think about when you're watching the Congressional Republicans? Does Ryan have what? Is it that difficult for him to corral that caucus?
Look, I think you've been seeing this happening over the last, what is it now, almost 8 to 10 years, where it's been an increasing split within the Republican caucus on any number of issues. So when you get to something like the immigration bill, you're going to see that contrast even more. I worked in the whip's office with Kevin McCarthy, and there were votes that you would think would be routine, and out of nowhere, you'd have a huge problem, and you'd be working the floor with every one of the deputy whips and trying to get something that should have been a routine bill passed. I think it's kind of the sign of the times of where we're at, where everything seems to be more polarized than it used to be and continues to be so.
Carson, thoughts?
I kind of look at this also through the kind of the greater picture also. This is not just about the farm bill, but it's about farmers in general also. A few weeks ago, there was what I thought was a great story about, is Trump losing the farmers around the trade war with China, and all of a sudden the Chinese putting massive tariffs on soybeans, which is actually very important for people like Iowa.
Yeah.
And so is this just kind of one more piece of the equation that then farmers are going to be a little bit more disillusioned with what Republicans are doing? And there's quite a few competitive elections in November for Congress in kind of the farm belt, if you were. But then also, is this potentially problematic for Trump when he's going for re-election in 2020? Of course, it's way too early for, I think, either of those to really kind of diagnose them. But it is just one more piece of the puzzle that suggests, wait a minute, maybe Washington, D.C. isn't having the back of the farmers when the farmers are so reflective in their support for the majority party.
Dan?
John, if I can just make one additional point, because the debate over immigration and the Farm Bill is a critical one and points to an inherent challenge that exists within the two-party system on both sides. If you have a multiple-party system, as they do in Italy, as they do in Israel, as they do in any number of other countries, you have the luxury of ideologically pure parties. Mm-hmm. When you have two major parties, as we do here, there are splits in them. And while it is entirely appropriate to criticize the Republicans for their inability to come together over years, as Sarah said, on the issue of immigration, this is something that bedevils both parties.
Yes.
The Democrats had a very pitched argument this week about whether to confirm a new CIA director. There's been a debate within the party about tax cuts, about international trade. And as we head into a new round of primaries tomorrow, a broader debate in both parties about whether it makes more sense to devote your time to motivating your base, your most conservative Republicans, your most progressive of Democrats, or reaching out to the center. So Ryan and immigration is an important issue, and it's a vexing one for him. It's just worth pointing out it's not a unique challenge. Both parties face it on an ongoing basis.
Well, didn't it used to be, though, that, yes, you had more mixture among the parties, within each party maybe, of different views, but you could get, the pro-immigration group maybe on one party to work with the pro-immigration people on the other party. But now it's got to be all, was it the Hastert Rule? They have to get the Republican caucus to pass it, and therefore it becomes that intra-party battle that can't get help from the folks who agree with whatever it is the leadership's trying to push through. I kind of wonder also, I'll throw this to all of you, I mean, is it polarization and things like that, or, I mean, say, this is in the Senate, but Lyndon Johnson, he's the former Senate Majority Leader, not a touchy-feely, sweet and kumbaya sort of person. He was pretty tough as nails, negotiator and arm twister and arm breaker. I mean, would he be as effective today as he was believed to be, at least, arguably, back when he was in that position? Carson?
I'm going to sort of not answer your question, but also kind of answer it at the same
That's
time.
fine. That's fair.
We'll answer it, John.
But I almost kind of have to wonder how much of this is basically when you are the party in control, when you're the majority. I mean, you start to fracture because you are the ones setting the agenda. You are the ones actually running the votes. When it's a little bit easier when you're in the minority to show a unified front because you are just the opposition. You're not really the one setting the votes. You're not really the one kind of setting the policy. And so right now, you have this really juxtaposition between Republicans and Democrats because Republicans control all three branches of the legislature and then, of course, the White House. You tend to forget that Nancy Pelosi threw the Blue Dogs under the bus when she controlled the House in the early parts of the Obama administration. And you really saw them get decimated when it came to elections. That was a strategic decision that she made to kind of push forward a lot of liberal policies in that first few years before the 2010 midterm elections. But Boehner and Ryan really weren't, I don't think, willing to do that, either for their moderates or for the kind of the more Tea Party Freedom Caucus individuals within their caucus. partly because they realized that what they saw with the decimation of the Blue Dogs, they kind of need both factions to maintain the majority and maintain the leadership. But it's easier to kind of clobber together kind of the pro-immigration people in Republican Party and Democrats when I would theorize you have a split in the Senate and the House. What we saw kind of out of the Gang of Eight situation really was a split of kind of Democratic and kind of Republican control of the two chambers that really kind of drove the message forward. Now, of course, both parties and all those individuals involved really got stabbed in the back by the respective parties, and therefore I think there's a lot of hesitation to be able to do that again in the future.
And I think one of the hardest things that you're going to find in Congress today that I think really does prevent a lot of collaboration and a lot of people coming together like the Gang of Eight is the kind of 24-hour news machine that exists and the need for content constantly. So you can be sitting in a meeting where something's being discussed, and if there are 8 people in the room, it's all the senators, and suddenly Politico or Axios is posting a new piece about what's coming out, saying this is actually being discussed. It gets the outrage machine goes, you see the tweets, and it scares people. It scares people to throw out the big ideas that I think you used to be able to do when Lyndon Johnson was in charge. Have those conversations, flesh them out in a way that's reasonable and takes a little bit more time than maybe 5 seconds. When, with technology today, it makes it almost impossible to have those kind of big ideas conversations where you start it crazy and find something that works.
Well, and even if you don't go back as far as Lyndon Johnson, there's a story for those of you who have not yet seen it, a fascinating story on the New York Times website that went up earlier today about how former President Bill Clinton is essentially persona non grata for Democratic primary candidates in much of the country this year, because he represents a more centrist and a more collaborative approach that has fallen dramatically out of fashion in both parties. Here's a man who is arguably one of the few greatest political minds of the modern era, whether you happen to support him or not, and he has been marginalized within his own party, because whether you point to Johnson, whether you point to Clinton, whether you point to Reagan, the idea of reaching across party lines has fallen decidedly out of fashion. I tell my students at both SC and at Cal, I tell them about Clinton and Newt Gingrich working together. I tell them about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill working together to save Social Security. I may as well be telling them about my favorite blacksmith. They don't doubt that I'm telling the truth. It just has no relevance to them in the 21st century.
Well, you also you bring it here to California, so you have Rockies Chavez, who's running for Congress down in San Diego and Orange County. He sided with Sacramento Democrats on a few key things, the biggest one being the renewal of cap and trade here in the state of California, his vote being one of the most decisive ones in Sacramento. And right now, the DCCC, the campaign arm of the Congressional Democrats, is attacking him for increasing spending and government regulation over the state's economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Things you would think that the Club for Growth would be attacking him on. Meanwhile, it's being funded by the DCCC. Well, you have the state Democrats who are right now furious at DC Democrats over this, because now it's going to make every other future Republican in Sacramento, while they don't really have too much control on issues like that, you kind of have to collaborate together. It's still 1 or 2 Republicans to vote for some of these key issues. They're going to have a lot of skittish Republicans now.
Well, there are not going to be a lot of skittish Republicans in California just because there are not a lot of Republicans of any type in California. But
it even goes to show that even if you bring it down to the state level, there are really clear differences of a strategic opinion, but also policy opinions at the same time.
How many of you were here when Robert Reich was here recently? And he told a story about when during the Clinton administration, he was the labor secretary, and he would occasionally meet Senator Alan Simpson, a Republican, and it got to the point where they had to meet secretly because their own staffs would be so upset with them meeting with the enemy that it just got absurd, and they should be able to talk because they have to be able to have private conversations and personal relationships and stuff like that. It kind of got ludicrous. So let's move on, and I want to talk about some state and local elections. And someone from the audience notes, actually this is just where I was going to lead anyway, Trump recently endorsed for California governor a man who is not from California and never won an election in his life, businessman John Cox, rather than a charismatic native son politician who has won all 3 of his elections and voted for Trump, that being Travis Allen. I think this letter was perhaps written by Travis Allen. Mr. Allen, welcome to the crowd. Do you think there was some sort of a payoff? I don't know about that, but I would like to just ask, what did you think about that? Is that a help for John Cox? And if so, with which groups in the state would that help him? Anyone?
I tweeted out almost immediately, I'm still bullish on Antonio Villagrosa making it into the top 2. John Fleischman, who runs one of the Flash Report, one of the go-to conservative blogs in the States, replied to me saying, well, it depends on how much money Cox puts behind this and how much money Newsom's campaign puts behind this. Because obviously Gavin Newsom wants John Cox to be in the top 2 because that makes Newsom's job essentially seamless to waltz into the governorship for the state of California. John Cox obviously wants to be, in the top 2 also for obvious reasons. But I'm still bullish on the fact that there being a D versus D election here for November for a variety of reasons. But it really does come down to how much can Cox and or his allies / opponents make the Republican conservative voters, the what's left of Republicans who are, for better or worse, Trump Republicans in this state know that Trump endorsed this particular candidate over the person who has been talking, Travis Allen has been talking repeatedly about he is the only one who has voted for Trump. Travis Allen has no money. Cox does have a little bit, but Antonio Villagrosa has a lot more between stuff that he has in his own campaign war chest and everything else that people like Bloomberg and a bunch of other very wealthy people are putting into his campaign. So I'm unconvinced that it's going to make that big of an impact quite yet.
We were talking about this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, but in the primary, it comes down to just a basic political decision: who has the best chance of actually getting onto the ticket. And as you pointed out, someone with no money, lower name recognition, that's where the political machine can come in and say, this non-native son, someone that hasn't won an election but has a better chance of winning, we're going to go with him, I think.
We were talking in the back before we came out here about where Republicans and even non-Republican conservatives in the state are, and of course they're already voting, right? We're already mailing in our ballots. What are your thoughts that you can say about that? I mean, are they going to stick, do you think, with Cox and or Allen or Villagrosa? I assume they're not going to go for Newsom, but maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if you start with the premise, just to build off the points that Carson and Sarah were making, Newsom, of course, will finish first and by a fairly sizable margin in the primary in 2 weeks. I've not been cured of my habit of making predictions, even though I vowed after November of 2016 to never make another political prediction. But if you assume that the polls are somewhat accurate and that Newsom is going to finish first by a sizable margin, you have a 4, if not 5-way fight for that second spot. And Gavin Newsom gave us perhaps the most telling moment in the last gubernatorial debate when he rubbed his hands together with glee and visibly salivated at the thought of having a Republican, any Republican, as his general election opponent in November, whereas running against Villagrosa or John Chung or Delane Easton would be a much greater challenge. I'd frame the race this way. As we all know, turnout drops dramatically in non-presidential and midterm elections. It drops even more dramatically among minority voters, particularly among African American and Latino voters. If Antonio Villagrosa can motivate Latino voters to turn out at presidential levels rather than midterm levels, then he will make the runoff and odds are becomes the next governor of California. If he is not able to motivate Latino and Latina voters to turn out at presidential levels, but rather at more historical norms, what you'll usually see in midterm elections, then he probably comes up short. The question, and this gets to your point about Cox, if Antonio Villagrosa, well, I'd say it this way, Antonio Villagrosa may or may not be able to motivate the Latino turnout along the lines that I just described. The question is, can Donald Trump motivate the Latino turnout to that level? And the single most valuable asset that Villagrosa has in this race is not the Trump presence in the campaign, but rather the Trump presence in society. And so I think what will determine that second spot in the primary more than anything else is whether the President of the United States motivates his allies or his opponents to a greater degree. Do people turn out because he endorsed one candidate, or do they turn out because of animus toward him and his administration after 2 years?
Sarah, what do you think? Where do you think the conservative vote will go in the state?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. As my professor at Cal once told me, people like to go with winners, and they like to choose winners and vote for winners. So if Republicans or moderate Republicans across the spectrum, if they think that they have a better chance of influencing the election or choosing someone that isn't going to be an extreme liberal, or someone that could be a little bit more of a moderate liberal and maybe get more of the ideas passed that they support, maybe someone like Villaraigosa, who is able to work with some pension reform, who's gone up against the teachers' unions and is supporting school choice, is that better than maybe having, knowing you're most likely going to lose with a Republican candidate in the fall? So I think that's going to be a very interesting situation. I think it's also, plays into people that call themselves Republicans that don't support Trump. Myself, Trump endorsing John Cox just makes me think, okay, there's someone else for me. So how does that affect the wide spectrum of Republicans that are going to be voting and that are still registered as Republicans? And does that actually help, candidates, the non-Newsom candidates, pull into the second place spot?
Yeah. I mean, I look at this. I mean, I'm more of a policy person than the political people that Dan and Sarah may be. But I look at it. What's going to warrant the best debate for the state of California? I think that if Jerry Brown had actually debated Neil Kashkari in 2014, that would have yielded a great debate. But Brown decided not to. But I thought that was, the right choice, the right move to go for the state of California, because they both had great ideas. They both had a lot of passion for the state. And this time around, I really do feel like it's going to be Newsom versus Villaraigosa, or Newsom versus John Chung, the state treasurer, who's going to yield the best debate. But then when you look at just the fundamentals, yes, Latino vote is very important in California. Villaraigosa should be able to drive that. If he can't, then there are some serious issues just functionally with his campaign. But also you have to think about money, but you also think about geography. Villaraigosa and John Chung are both from Los Angeles County. However, Villaraigosa has the wherewithal of being the former mayor of Los Angeles City, whereas John Chung has never really held a local office. He held the Board of Equalization office for Southern California, but no one really knows who those people are.
Maybe this room.
Maybe you guys do, but I would be amazed if I walked down the street and hey, can you tell me who your four members of the Board of Equalization are? Most people would be like, what's the Board of Equalization? But being mayor of the city of Los Angeles is a lot different than being the one of 4 Board of Equalization members. And then since then, John Chung has been a statewide officer, so he's not really a kind of a native son, if you were, of Los Angeles, the way that Newsom is of San Francisco, the way Villaraigosa is of Los Angeles. So that also helps, even though Los Angeles is dwarfed when it comes to primary votes from the Bay Area, it's still the largest area population-wise of California. So
although voter turnout among Southern California Democrats has historically been much lower than among Bay Area Democrats, which is another added advantage for Newsom. John, if I can poach on Carson's turf and talk public policy for just a minute, I promise.
Please do.
I'm going to excuse myself.
If Cox is the second candidate against Newsom, you'll see a very classic R versus D debate of the type that, to some degree, has taken place in the last several gubernatorial campaigns here. But, and Sarah alluded to this briefly, where Villaraigosa and Newsom agree on most issues, if they do end up running against each other, I think you will see a fascinating and just as heated debate over public education in this state. For lack of, at the risk of being overly glib on both sides, the unions versus the charters, and it's obviously a much more complicated matrix of issues than that. Teacher hiring and retention, student test scores. There are two such pitched camps in the public education debate in this state and around the country. And this is an issue that I think obviously is critical to the state's future. Even if Newsom and Bietigheim agree on most things, watching the two candidates talk in a way that we've never seen as voters, two high-profile candidates debate the future of our state's public education system, that's a pretty profound policy discussion.
I mean, it really will be. I mean, yeah, Brown and Whitman really kind of got into it during the 2010 campaign. But really, since then, we really haven't had a statewide true debate on what does the future of California look like. And that's to the detriment of policy within the state of California, because the legislature can kind of go off and do whatever they want to do. And given the 2/3 majorities that the Democrats will likely hold in the legislature, that means you're going to get not well thought out policies. And if you're not having a debate at the gubernatorial level that's really going to be driving the agenda, then you're going to start getting a little bit wonky, fishy, not so good ideas that aren't really thought out and then yield really bad, negative, unintended consequences down the road.
Very good. Briefly, are there any primaries within the state? Any congressional primaries or other primaries that you're watching you find interesting? And there's been a lot of talk about, Democrats kind of doing Democrat on Democrat crime, because there are so many of them, and then there's the whole progressive versus moderate, or progressive versus liberal wing, and that I think points to the whole Bill Clinton in the wilderness aspect. But anything that, are any of those GOP seats that were supposedly vulnerable going to actually turn, or do you think they'll hold on to them?
This could be the election to break the top two, I think, potentially. If you have enough of the congressional races with R versus R, especially those ones that the Democrats are really targeting, Isa's seat, Ed Royce's seat in Orange County, maybe Dana Rohrabacher's seat in Orange County as well, and some others. Then, of course, you have a top two, Democrat versus Democrat at the Senate level and the gubernatorial level. You could really see maybe both major parties, Republicans and Democrats, and you can quibble if the Republicans are a major party anymore. But you can really see those two parties really coming together and putting something on the ballot for 2020 to either amend or get rid of top two.
There are currently fewer Republicans in the California congressional delegation than there are players on the Golden State Warrior roster. There are 15 Warriors and 14 Republicans, so it's close. In 7 of those 14 seats, as most of you know, in 7 of those 14 districts, Hillary Clinton defeated Donald Trump in 2016. That doesn't make them Democratic districts. Rather, what it makes them is sort of old school traditional Republican districts. These are George Bush, Mitt Romney, John McCain Republicans as opposed to Donald Trump Republicans. That said, they're more evenly pitched fights than we've seen in these seats in Orange County, in Ventura County, in the Central Valley than has been the case in modern history. And in at least 3 or 4 of those, the Democratic Party is so energized, and this gets to your point, John, there are too many Democratic candidates.
Yeah.
And the possibility exists that in 2 or 3 of these San Diego County and Orange County districts, that the preponderance of Democratic candidates on the ballot will split their vote to a degree that 2 Republicans go on to the general election. And Carson, to his credit, alluded to this earlier. The Democratic Congressional Committee is working very hard right now to try to avoid that eventuality. But I think on election night, at least at the congressional level, watching to see whether there is a D and an R that comes out of those Southern California districts, I think is going to be critically important, not just for California, but for overall control of the House of Representatives come November.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think these guys have summed it up pretty well. Yeah.
Well, here's something that involving the California election that actually leads right into our next topic. So some Californians are receiving anti-Semitic robocalls about Senator Dianne Feinstein. They're coming from supporters of rogue Republican and neo-Nazi candidate Patrick Little. The calls label her a, quote, traitorous Jew, unquote, and say that Little will, quote, get rid of all the nation-wrecking Jews from our country, unquote. Now, as disturbing as that is, it's not completely unusual occurrence these days. I mean, we all saw that white New York City lawyer who went off on a rant because two people had the audacity to speak Spanish at a restaurant in New York. And quite a few white people seem to have the police on speed dial when it comes to being around people of color. I mean, across the pond, Britain's Labour Party is being riven with accusations of anti-Semitism, and Jeremy Corbyn, their party leader, his inability to respond effectively to this. Sarah, you recently wrote about this on Medium, and I
Yeah.
wonder if you could give us your thoughts about what's happening, what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's horrifying what we're seeing all across, not just here in America, but you're seeing it across the pond. You pointed out in the UK elections, it became a really big hotspot, and I think thankfully what you saw was people responding to the anti-Semitism and rejecting. It really impacted the Labour Party because of their inability to deal with the anti-Semitic views that are bubbling up from the grassroots. In the Momentum Party, you had a number of party leaders resign their posts within this grassroots movement because of the anti-Semitism that was coming up. You had people coming up to leaders on the streets expressing views that I didn't think could be possible to still exist. So I think at the end of the day, these tactics are going to backfire on these candidates and what they support and what they view. I think the vast majority of people are good and don't agree with this kind of topic, but I do think it's something that's extraordinarily concerning, and we need to be looking at the root causes of it and what does it mean. My grandfather was in the concentration camps, so for me it's extraordinarily personal. But I did talk with he has one sister that survived with him, and I was talking to her about it and, my concerns, and she said, Sarah, just remember this is still the greatest country on the face of the earth. So for her to feel that way about the United States and that we will all join together and fight these absurd ideas, I think is encouraging. So I want to share that with everyone here. But we do need to address it. We can't let it hide. And I think there should be serious consequences for anyone that supports any sort of intolerance towards anyone for race, religion, gender, sexuality, anything. I think we're past that, and we should be past that if we're not.
Carson, maybe start with you. I mean, what's the role of our political leaders and our political institutions with something like this, or should they not be? Should this be something that's dealt with on a, if you will, a civilian level?
No, I mean, parties are essentially clubs, and party leadership should kind of dictate what they want that club to look like. It's no one's right to be affiliated with any party, actually. I mean, these are closed clubs, and so the clubs really get to dictate who the membership really ought to be and is. I do have to credit the California Republican Party because they did kick out this Patrick Little guy from their convention a few weekends ago in San Diego, and made a very clear statement that he is not representative of what the California Republican Party is all about. So, I mean, I have to applaud them for that because they very easily could have just kind of brushed him aside, said, "Oh, he's whatever. He's just like some dude running for Senate." But they really kind of try to make an effort out of it. So it is up to the leadership of the parties to really make a very clear statement about what is allowed and what isn't allowed, and go from there. And to Sarah's point, I mean, James Corbyn has really not been able to do so within the labor movement, and they have been punished already for it, and they're going to continue to be punished for it until they can kind of figure it out. And you're seeing it not just in those places, but also France, Germany, and many other places around the world. And so it is. That's what leadership is all about. Is even if the masses theoretically are behind something, if it's not where you really think is strategically smart, but also just good to go, then it's up to you as a leader to make the difficult stance and make a difference. And so the leaders ought to be kind of the leaders in a sense, in every sense of the word.
I have some good news, and it comes from Russia, and this I actually mean this seriously, but it'll be weird to say it. And that is when they've done, they've now been able to start studying and identifying a lot of the messages that the Russian government trolls were putting into social media, and still are, but particularly during the election. And a lot of them played on racial and other, divisions. And so, the reason I say this is good or a positive note is that to some degree what we're seeing is a hyped up problem. The lawyer in New York who apparently, this was only one of 3 of his videotaped rants, he may know the law, but he doesn't know how to avoid a video camera. I mean, but it does prove, yes, there are genuinely people who are an issue here. But thankfully, we can rest on at least a little bit of knowledge that to some degree, this is being pumped up by outsiders trying to feed on these divisions. And the guy in St. Petersburg who works at the Internet Research Agency, he doesn't really care if you like blacks or like whites. He's just trying to push whatever buttons will cause trouble.
John, I interpreted the news out of Russia a little bit differently.
Oh, please do.
Than you did, and frankly, with much greater alarm.
Me too.
Because these Russian technology experts did not create these racial divisions and sensitivities in our country. They exploited them.
Yeah.
And they figured out very quickly on the right and the left that the single best way to engineer clickbait, to get people to respond quickly and emotionally and repeatedly, was to send out racially charged messages in both directions. In other words, they didn't do anything that we didn't give them the opportunity to do. I thought Sarah's piece, and for those of you who haven't read it, it's POMPEI on Medium. And I can say, as her very, very, very proud former professor, that you read something like this and it makes you feel better about the future, regardless of what your party registration happens to be. And even for those of you who may have voted for a different presidential candidate than she has in past years, read this and feel better about our future. Joe Biden, a slightly older political philosopher, Joe Biden, wrote a piece for The Atlantic about a year ago, and I quoted it the last time I was here, and I'm coming back to it, and I'll apologize for those of you who are here because I think it's really, really important. He wrote this right after Charlottesville. He said, "The giant forward steps we've taken in recent years on civil liberties and civil rights and human rights are being met by a ferocious pushback from the oldest and darkest forces in America. Are we really surprised they rose up? Are we really surprised they lashed back? Did we really think they would be extinguished with a whimper rather than a fight?" And I have to admit, I did.
Me too.
I really did. I thought that we had moved past that. And if there is the barest of silver linings about the kind of hatred and ugliness that comes out of Charlottesville and Mr. Little's comments, it's a reminder that this stuff doesn't go away. And as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think realizing that there are people in society, good people in society, with whom you might disagree on abortion rights or marriage equality or the research and development tax credit, but are willing to stand with you to push back against this kind of hatred and bigotry, that to me is the greatest value that an organization like Commonwealth Club provides, which means we can disagree about who we're going to vote for in a primary for governor, as long as we remember when the election is over that there are greater truths that unite us, and it's worth standing up against the Littles of the world, the Corbyns of the world, and those who make it as easy as it was for the Russians to inflict the damage on our election system that they did 2 years ago.
I think Joe Biden should be quoting you.
Agreed.
Well, moving along, happy anniversary, everyone. Congratulations. It's 1 year ago since Robert Mueller started his investigation into Russian meddling in the campaign, which I do want to point out I'm not in favor of. Of course, when this anniversary came about, President Trump and his supporters embarked on a renewed and I think widened attack on Mueller on the very legitimacy of the investigation. Carson, on our last Week to Week, we discussed the kind of the wild rollout of Rudy Giuliani as one of Trump's lawyers, as if Giuliani had gone off the rails. I'm kind of wondering if Giuliani isn't doing exactly what he's supposed to, which is to get out there and attack.
Yeah.
And it almost doesn't matter whether he's right or on message or off, whatever, but to get out there and be defending the president and attacking and giving no quarter. What's your thought?
There was, and for the life of me, I'm blanking on actually who published it, but it may have been a Politico, it may have been something else, that did an analysis of Kellyanne Conway. And why does MSNBC, why does CNN continue to have her on their shows? Because the author was basically theorizing she has this uncanny ability to just kind of tie the host up in knots of just kind of very zigzag sort of rationality that gets the hosts all kind of flustered and unfamiliar and really doesn't know where they're going. And then before you know it, time's up and they're moving on to commercial and she's never answered anything. And the host just left there like, what just happened? And so the whole thing was, why do they keep on having her on if this is what she is consistently doing to every single host? It kind of seems like Giuliani's doing the same thing. Kind of just throwing out things left and right that then, of course, the Twitter bots are chasing here and there, here and there. That CNN is blasting breaking news, even though they break news on literally everything. Politico, my phone's just popping up. And I'm like, well, that's not really breaking news. I heard that 5 hours ago. But it's this whole thing of confusion. It's throwing, basically everything you possibly can out and hoping that you're just kind of muddying the waters so much so that, again, like what Sarah was pointing with not even the 24-hour news network, it's the instantaneous news cycle now that we have, that no one can really kind of keep up, and therefore you're kind of just shuffling the issues side to side and then hoping that there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah. I think Rudy Giuliani is doing exactly what they want him to do. I think we're sitting here not talking about the fact that we have a president that is under investigation for, any number of different things. We're talking about Rudy Giuliani's crazy tactics and what did he say that's true and what did he say that's not true and where does the actual truth come into play? And I have no idea. I couldn't tell you. And Rudy Giuliani is the perfect person to do it. So I think he's doing exactly what they want him to do. I have no clue what he's supposed to be saying, what he's not supposed to be saying, but I can tell you that it's working very effectively. And we're not talking about the root issue of what the cause is going on, what is being investigated, what are the allegations. We're talking about the theater that's going on around it, and that is what they're designed to do and what they want to do.
It's very much Chicago on CNN, essentially.
I'll offer. This is my theory on Rudy Giuliani.
I love it.
He was hired to be the first friend. So the presidency, the presidency, if you think about it, is a very extraordinarily lonely job to begin with. Even if you do have friends, like most presidents have, and Trump, by his own admission, and I'm not saying this is a good or a bad thing, it's just the way he's lived his life, has made it clear in talking to interviewers that throughout his life, he doesn't have friends. He has business associates, and he values his relationships with his family very much, but he really doesn't have friends and is seen genuinely puzzled when the question comes to him. So there he is in the White House in this incredibly isolating job, and one by one, the people who he knew best leave. Steve Bannon leaves, and Sean Spicer leaves, and I wouldn't have predicted a time when America would have become alarmed when Hope Hicks left the White House, but we did. And so all of us, and so the people who were sort of his reinforcement network are all gone. And all of a sudden, his friend Rudy from New York shows up. And I think it's just, and I think he just likes having somebody who he can hang out with and feel comfortable with. And the fact that he goes on TV and creates this kind of confusion, as Carson and Sarah talked about, is an added bonus. It's really just nice to have someone to hang with.
I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really kind of talk to that, but I could see all of this becoming problematic if it ever ends up in a court. Because basically, Rudy's saying things, a bunch of people are saying things that could ultimately kind of be pieced together by a good prosecutor, Mueller, that essentially leads the jury in a way that the prosecutor wants it to go. So while you're creating this confusion, which is good for the PR prospect right now, and kind of keeping people off their balance, if it does ultimately end up in a court situation, it could become a little bit more problematic and
I was just
bad.
going to say that's
Yeah.
a season 2 problem.
But I think you've just summed it up really effectively, Carson. It's a tremendous strategy for cable news, not nearly as effective a strategy for a special prosecutor.
What do you think about the development that we're learning that there wasn't just a meeting with Donald Trump Jr. and the Russians, there was a meeting with Donald Trump Jr. with an emissary for 2 Gulf state princes who offered to help the campaign. Sarah, what do you think about this? Is this serial sloppiness or serial collusion?
I mean, I couldn't even say at this point. I mean, not knowing anything, based on what I've seen, based on what I know from people that were involved in the campaign, reporters that I've talked with, I would have to imagine it was sloppiness in the beginning, and best case, maybe that's what I want to believe, because I would hope that they wouldn't be colluding with foreign governments, but. That just seems so outrageous, but there's starting to be a pattern of it, and maybe it's a pattern of sloppiness, maybe it's going to be a pattern of something worse that we find out about, but at the very least, it's mind-boggling that was even allowed to happen, and it's clear that it was that they didn't have the sort of infrastructure in place that they would need to protect themselves, let alone the country, from these kinds of things from happening. I can tell you, having worked on presidential campaigns in the past, any of the fantastic lawyers that we had around would never have allowed a meeting like that to take place, ever.
I don't know if you saw this.
Yeah, and common sense, I'll give you that.
I don't know if you saw this story on Politico, but Donald Trump has a cell phone that he's using that does not have the security stuff on it to prevent, to make sure that it's not hacked or otherwise messed with by anyone. And I think we all remember when Barack Obama became president, he very reluctantly gave up his BlackBerry because they had to use a secure thing. And excuse me, every 30 days, he would turn the phone in to the tech folks, and they would check it to make sure it was still secure. Donald Trump apparently has gone for 5 months without turning in his, as we already know, insecure phone for checking. So design or sloppiness, I guess we're back to, and that's the same issue with the meetings with various folks. Is this by design, or as someone from the audience said regarding to the Giuliani thing, it's like, this is his tactic. This is the way he does stuff.
You would just think that after a big deal was made about a private server in a house in New York being such a big deal, that at least someone would think, well, wait a minute, isn't this kind of similar? It is similar. I mean, unsecured private server, unsecured phone. Everything was litigated about Hillary Clinton's server. Why hasn't anyone stopped this? And let alone the person who made such a big deal about it, Donald Trump himself.
Sarah, you've been in these campaigns. How much power do the people around the candidate have to get the candidate to do something he or she doesn't want to do?
That's a loaded question.
It is. And understanding that Donald Trump is a particular force of energy, but
Look, the campaigns that I've worked on, and I was not at all involved with the Trump campaign or even close to it. I think it's much like many of the companies. The leadership comes from the top down. The candidate or the CEO really dictates how you're going to act, and so I've been very fortunate. I had the wise advice of Dan Schnur, who told me never to work for someone I didn't believe in. And I've taken that from politics into the corporate world as well. It's served me fantastically. But the people that really want to do the right thing, I think that's how they govern. They want different ideas. They want to have those big policy debates. Getting them to do things they don't want to do is not easy. So if they know it's for the betterment of the country, the office, whatever it is, you can sometimes get there, and then a lot of the times you find an alternative route that is something that they're more willing to do. I know Dan's got some fantastic stories about this that he's told me over the years as well. But I think for someone like Trump, we've seen it time and time again. If he doesn't want to do it, it doesn't happen. It's going to happen his way. Some of the people that he brought into the White House and into the executive branch have not been able to convince him of anything that he didn't want to do, and they're gone. And
if you look at it from his perspective, that's a very appropriate way to act, because the quote-unquote conventional advisors he had, the Paul Manaforts, the Sean Spicers, and so on, they told him he could never become the Republican nominee for president acting in a certain way, and he did. They told him he could never become president acting in a certain way, and he did. And so now, aside from just the innate joy he takes about sticking his finger in the eye of the establishment, he's got 2-3 years of learned behavior to say, if these conventional, traditional politicos are telling me it's the wrong thing to do, then I must be doing just fine.
Mm-hmm. What did you think about his call on, was it Sunday, on a tweet to have the Department of Justice investigate whether or not the FBI had planted someone in his campaign? Any thoughts, any reactions? Carson?
This is probably going to be a little bit unpopular here. And again, I think most of you know that I'm not a Trump supporter, but if there was meddling by the Department of Justice under the Obama administration or the FBI, then it ought to be investigated to at least determine whether it happened or not. Because that sort of stuff should not be happening. The US government should not be spying on campaigns. And whether it was a part of a larger investigation, that needs to be determined. So I'm not fully against it per se, because it ought to happen, because we need to have the highest amount of confidence in our intelligence and law enforcement officers to make sure that they are doing what they ought to do, which is protect our nation from foreign adversaries, from people within. And so if that were the case, then it needs to be determined whether it was happening, and if it was happening, why it was happening, and kind of move forward from there. You can't just discount it completely just because Trump tweeted it. And that's what I fear that the Democrats are going to fall into. Just because Trump's saying it or one of Trump's surrogates are saying it, it has to be discounted immediately or made fun of or discounted. And if they continue to do that, they're going to fall into a really bad trap where some of these things may actually have stickiness to them, may actually have accuracy to them. And now all of a sudden they've discounted something that is in itself also a very problematic and maybe troubling situation. So the DOJ should look into it and determine kind of whether there is something there or not.
I'm not sure that's terribly unpopular here. I think a lot of folks can go with that. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
No, I'd agree with that. I think if it's proven true, it's going to be, absolutely, I think almost a watershed moment in American government and
Sure,
American
he will be
politics.
proven correct about something.
And I also think it's a great timing for midterm elections. It's something that motivates the base. It's something that motivates Republicans, and maybe even some folks who are just anti-government, anti-establishment across the spectrum, folks that would be concerned about something like that.
I think Sarah's last point is worth picking up, because as alarming as a lot of these things are, and as much fun as they are to criticize, it is worth noting that the President of the United States maintains an approval rating, while low, still maintains the support of roughly 40% of the electorate in this country. I have a friend who does what I used to do, who runs political campaigns, and what he told me back in 2013, 2014, is he was seeing something really unusual, really unique in his public opinion polling. He said, for years and years and years, we've seen voters who've been dismissive, who've been disgusted, who've been angry about politics. He said, we're seeing a different attitude now. Or I should say, they're not disgusted anymore, they're dismissive. In other words, what I'm hearing from them, my friend told me, is their attitude saying, anyone can do it. It's not that hard. And their opinion of the more traditional political leaders of both parties had sunk to such a low level that it didn't seem to them that it would be that difficult a thing to do. And if you are a voter, and there's a longer conversation to be had another night, and I know you all have had it here on many occasions, where you felt like the traditional leaders of both parties were not listening to you, and you really did think that things could not get any worse for you, you turned toward a non-traditional candidate. And whether that candidate's name was Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, it was affected by all sorts of things. But even as we criticize the president, deservedly, for any of the number of things we've talked about, it's worth remembering why so many of our fellow Americans have supported him and still do. I'd encourage you, for those of you who haven't, go back and watch the Center of American Progress Ideas Conference that they had in Washington, D.C. last week. They had more than a dozen of the potential Democratic presidential candidates talking about their ideas for the future. And whether you happen to be a D or an R or an NPP like myself, you watch that and you think, this is a group of really, really intelligent people, none of whom are really speaking to those voters who turned to Trump or who turned to Sanders out of desperation. And watching this election progress, not just 2018, but 2020, watching to see how the Trump alternatives move beyond the disparagement into offering alternatives, to me, that's the most important part of this and the next election cycle.
Very good. For our final topic, I'm not really sure we're going to have anything new to say about this. I just think we at least have to mention it, and that is, in the latest school shooting in this country, 10 people died at Santa Fe High School near Houston. The Texas lieutenant governor claimed that the schools have too many doors, so they're hard to guard. New NRA President Oliver North said that students were drugged with Ritalin and they're to blame. Again, don't know if anything new can be said, because this seems to be just what we do, is comment and Facebook about, kids being killed in schools. But people have been, yes, there is a cartoon that, again, has been shared on Facebook a lot of up in heaven, these two angels saying, oh, they keep sending us their thoughts and prayers, and the other angel says, and their children. So, any thoughts about the latest?
I mean, I think the last time I was on, there was a school shooting shortly before the panel. I made a comment that someone came up to me and afterward to talk a little bit about, but until the gun control movement really is able to kind of take the passion there is around gun control and turn it into votes to really battle the Second Amendment movement that is able to turn their passion into votes, then you're not really going to get much change in DC per se. Now, can you really kind of do things at the state level? I think so. But it really comes down to the saliency of the issue for the voters. And for better or worse, I mean, again, thoughts and prayers are now falling on deaf ears now. So I think there are more and more people wanting action regardless of their political affiliation. But the saliency really needs to be there. And voters really need to turn out for the candidates who are not claiming to take everyone's guns away, because that's also the kind of the reaction of, there needs to be a messaging around it that really kind of talks about what most Americans do agree on. And there's quite a few issues there that you have approval ratings of 80 to 90% of Americans agreeing on. But you have to be able to figure out a way to translate that into votes. And right now, the gun control side hasn't really been able to figure out the best messenger candidates or way to kind of move that forward at this point. And until they can, then unfortunately, thoughts and prayers are what we're going to get.
Bill Clinton, who, as I mentioned earlier, I think is one of the great political minds of the modern era, whether you happen to agree with him ideologically or not, gave a speech to a Democratic National Committee event shortly after the Sandy Hook tragedy. And I'm paraphrasing, I can't quote him directly, but essentially what he said is this. He said, I'm with you, you know that. He said, I'm with you on assault weapons ban, I'm with you on the gun show loopholes, right down the line. He said, but I've got a lot of friends, a lot of good people who I know from my home state of Arkansas who don't agree with us. And he said, and our problem isn't that just that they don't agree with us, President Clinton said. Our problem is that they think that we think that they're stupid. And so when they hear us call for gun control, they don't hear us merely disagreeing with them on a matter of public policy. They hear us denigrating them and insulting not only them, but their way of life. And if we're ever going to move forward on this issue, he goes, I've convinced a lot of people of a lot of things over the years. I've never convinced anyone of anything by telling them how stupid they are. Right. And I think, as is the case in many other instances, Bill Clinton gives excellent advice on this. There are some issues that are persuasion issues, where you can move people horizontally on taxes, on healthcare, even on immigration. Gun control has become not a persuasion issue, but a motivation issue. When politicians of both parties talk about it, they're not really trying to change minds anymore. They're simply trying to motivate the bases of their respective parties. And I think one of to me, the real the real tiny little silver lining that came out of Parkland was not so much the passage of any particular measure, but a reminder to the elected officials of both parties that this is not just a base motivational ploy to turn out your supporters in midterm elections, that this is an issue where we expect our leaders to engage in conversation. As Carson said, there is opportunity for middle ground, not on every issue in the gun debate, but on some. And if we're willing to engage in the conversation without telling people who disagree with us how stupid or evil they are, then our chances of success and progress increase dramatically.
And, to add to that, I think this is such a complex issue just at the gun debate level, assault weapons ban, gun show loopholes, where do we go? Then when you dig down into it and get to some of the other, not just the availability of guns, but why are these kids, why do they feel they need to go and kill their classmates? Why do they feel they need to go in the first place? You're getting to a mental health issue that people are still reluctant to talk about because, again, if you think guns are a difficult conversation, mental health is something that nobody's even started really talking about. How do you fix that? How do you make these resources available? Then you're getting into funding. You're getting into, healthcare. It's a whole can of worms that I think people are not willing to go forth and tackle. Maybe you don't have the right answers right now, but I think that you can't just have the conversation about guns. You've got to get to the mental health issue as well. And I definitely don't have the answers, but if we can start just saying the words and start talking about it and start socializing it, can we get there? And can we provide, as a society, the help, the resources that these kids need, especially as we're transitioning with social media and the 24-hour bullying that's going on and the feelings of that they don't belong in their community or at their schools. And I think it's got to be a two-part conversation, and maybe one comes first and one comes second. But I think we need to hold our elected officials accountable and say, stop worrying about getting reelected. Do the right thing, and you're going to get reelected. I know it's a scary idea for most of them, but you've seen it time and time again, and it works. If you're willing to take bold actions, if you're willing to say the things that you actually believe in, it can work. So I think it's got to stop. We've got to figure this out sooner rather than later. We can't keep letting this be an every 2-month thing. I mean, it's every 2 weeks people are getting desensitized, and that's what really kind of traumatizes me about it.
We need to, as voters, all of us and all of your friends and everyone, to really start rewarding governing, rewarding conversations, not just rewarding people who partisanly or ideologically adhere to every single thing or close to every single thing that you may believe in. And then you're going to start actually tackling these issues, again, that massive majorities of all of us do agree on. But everyone right now is so afraid to actually have a conversation with someone else, whether it's on social media or whether it's in person. And until we can get back to that, and I don't know if we ever actually were there as a society, but I think we were. And until we can get back to there, then we can start to really kind of tackle some really big issues here in San Francisco, California, but also nationally.
We're going to have, of course, more news quiz questions and a lot more to talk about in 2 weeks on Monday, June 4th, right here at the Commonwealth Club. Thank you to our great panel, Dan Schnur, Sarah Pompey, Carson Bruno. Thanks to all of you for coming out and everyone watching and listening online. Have a great week.